Yes, we are on the other side, if you wish, of the insurance industry, and to put it openly, we could be seen as the people spending insurers' money, but actually we try to save the money of the industry and provide the right professional adjustment in order to pay losses as they should be paid. The question I was asked is climate change driving a change in the property insurance business? And I will try to provide you with our own point of view coming from the experience of loss adjusting. I will quickly go through these three items, leaving the third perhaps to only a few words, since there are other colleagues who have spoken more eminently than me, because we are not usually involved in statistics. We focus in depth in the single claim. But I think it's worth talking a little bit about the type of claim. So I borrowed from Mozart, Don Giovanni, Il catalogo è questo, the list of what is happening or what may happen in terms of kinds of claims, and we will see that there are new developments, if you wish, so new risks or new business for us in a sense, and we all need to be prepared to handle this. And I will also address frequency and severity or magnitude of the losses to some extent, and perhaps within that chapter I will try to raise a few disturbing questions for later debate. So let's see what happens. Well, floods. Who better than those who are named Floods Re, for example, or the colleagues who have spoken before me to talk about these. Of course, we are facing a number of these events, and we have to adjust losses which were once considered to be rare events or something which would happen seldom, now are becoming, unfortunately for many insurers, and perhaps fortunately for us loss adjusters, bread and butter, more than fire losses. So flood losses, which tend to be quite catastrophic events with large amounts paid, they may be the news on the media when you have events affecting large shares of population, but even smaller floods or more concentrated floods which affect industrial areas may cause very significant losses. So this is a pattern which we are seeing in a number of countries. We have had the experience in the recent past in France. We were shown a video of what happened in Paris. A colleague of ours had his house totally flooded by the Seine. Germany and Poland, to some extent, as was shown in the previous maps, share partly some common features. UK has just suffered significant floods a few years ago, which were the reason why Flood Re was established eventually. Italy is always a case on its own, really. We have all of the kind of floods you can imagine. So you have the traditional floods, you have the flash floods, you have concentrated floods. For example, let me just mention that I am hopefully ending now a long arbitration in which I was named the umpire by the head of the local court in Genoa for two floods events which occurred at a distance of 1.5 months one from the other, just 3 months after the inception of a policy by an international insurer, so they weren't that happy. And that happened, so with significant losses, which affected not only a portion of the city, but most of it. You know that Genoa has two main river flows and a number of ancillaries, and both of these, let me say, basins were significantly flooded. And that came after only a couple of years after another major flood loss. So insurers were confident that that wouldn't come again, and instead that has come back, and even settlement of these losses is not easy, as in our country you have a number, for example, of valuable monuments to which giving a value and the value of the loss may not be an easy task. So as we see, these events are affecting significantly mild climate countries, countries in which you would not expect to have, like, say, in the Caribbean or other areas, significant weather-related events. Then we have what on some markets are called water bombs or flash floods. They are events which were not typical in the past. They have become more and more frequent. They tend to be quite concentrated, and you have in a limited area a huge amount of water which goes far beyond the capacity of designed drainage systems, public and private, and you may have very significant concentrated losses. This again is a feature which was more common in tropical weathers and is now affecting a considerable amount of at least the Mediterranean countries, certainly notably our own country, Italy. Snowfalls, this is another kind of claim. I haven't heard much today. As you know, those of you who regularly go skiing, that it's more and more difficult to have decent snow to ski. But the snow which is not going on the tracks for your own enjoyment is accumulating and coming all together suddenly in specific spots. And I will show you pictures of what happened only a few years ago when a huge concentrated snowfall affected an industrial area. And of course, I'm mentioning industrial areas because they are insured, but not because other areas were not affected. We were not directly involved, but of course also civil buildings and private houses were affected to some extent. And snowfall in itself is perhaps not enough, but then you have a combination of temperature getting up and down, so you have a sort of block of ice, and then you have the wind hitting, and buildings are not designed to withstand a significant load with a side wind pushing it, and then you have a collapse. And then, of course, to this you add business interruption, supply chain interruption, and so and so. Hailstorms and tornadoes. Well, surprisingly, we are starting to have tornadoes in the Mediterranean. I was an eyewitness this summer of a tornado. I even took a video, and then I saw that people better than me posted it on the internet. Off the coast of Sicily, there were tornadoes, and you could clearly see not the levels you have in the Caribbean, but we are starting to have these events. And I will show you what happened a few years ago when a tornado, although we are not classifying them in the same way as in the Caribbean, hit an area not too far from Milan, closer to Bergamo actually, with a huge industrial area on its way. Other events, and this is perhaps taking us closer to what I wanted to offer you, perhaps as a topic for discussion, is we are not perhaps considering enough the impact, direct or indirect, which the change in the quality of the air, for example, is causing to man-made structures. I will talk a little bit about the Genoa bridge fall. Of course, I'm not suggesting that it was a natural catastrophe. It's clearly a man-made mistake, and there are a number of factors which will need to be assessed. But I will ask some questions in terms of, are we sure that a higher concentration of CO2, for example, is not affecting the resistance and the quality of the concrete over time? And is it not speeding up the corrosion process within the steel reinforcement? And how does all this behave in presence of SOx particles, which we all know are in the air for a number of factors related to cars, industrial outputs, and so on? And how does this integrate with extreme climatic conditions like extreme peaks in heat. We all know, for example, that concrete and steel behave differently in terms of temperature, and design, especially 50 years ago, would not consider certain extremes. So are we sure that the infrastructure we have, which can be a bridge, could be a tunnel, could be parts of buildings or other kinds of infrastructures, are actually still consistent, or is the current situation still consistent with the design assumptions which were made at the time? So, I was talking of floods in Genoa, and these are just pictures showing what happened. I don't know if I have a laser beam, well, whatever. Bottom right, you see what happened to Closter, I think is the English name, dating back from the 14th or 15th century, which basically collapsed due to a combination of surface waters and underground waters which came on the area. You see on top what happened to the side wall of a cemetery, and pictures to the left. Bottom left, by the way, is the monumental cemetery of Staglieno, which is a masterpiece. And by the way, assessing the value of the assets there is not an easy task. And this, as I said, is becoming something almost standard, which is happening with a certain frequency. This was what I was talking about in terms of snowfall. As I said, you could see two parts of the buildings which were originally built in the past with traditional, I would say, techniques, and then an automatic warehouse, taller building with reinforced concrete and parts in steel was built in the middle. And then when the snowfall came and you had a huge wayload on top and the wind hitting it on the side, as you can imagine, it was stuck in the middle of the two lower building areas, and eventually it collapsed. And of course, it prevented the process flow to continue from one end of the factory to the other, and this was an integrated factory causing very significant business interruption losses. This is just a picture showing what happened on a plant which was, as I was saying, close to Milan, affected a few years ago by a tornado. You can see the impact, and just for your information, it's a sort of steel mill, or actually they are manufacturing pipes for the oil and gas industry. And so you can imagine what the consequence was to the stock which was in process or finished in the warehouses. You could just not move forward without rechecking or reworking most of it for corrosion requirements. By the way, there were 500,000 square meters of roofs which were significantly damaged, only on that spot, and then there were other areas nearby. Perhaps less relevant in terms of insurance damages, but certainly not on the media, are wildfires. Top right is Portugal, bottom left is California. I think you all heard about them. There were casualties, especially in Portugal, significant casualties. These occurrences happen more and more often. Sometimes they are man-made, they are arsons, basically, for a number of reasons. Sometimes they are natural events. Anyway, these are happening more and more often. And now, let's address for a second the issue of the Genoa Bridge. You see here the part which is closer to the city center. Questions? Well, first of all, as long as we learn from the media now that the investigations are taking place in these very hours and will last a few weeks and months, I presume. But can we comfortably exclude any role in the failure, or at least in accelerating the degradation process of concrete and steel? We are not facing an asset similar to the bridges which were made by the Romans or the Ottomans. Imagine the Mostar Bridge, which stood for centuries, or Roman bridges which are still used today, and they will not be affected by air pollution. But infrastructures which were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, in an industrial way, precast concrete, ideally made according to certain assumptions and specifications, but perhaps manufacturing was a little bit differing from the ideal design. Load assumptions were different. At the time, we didn't have truckloads like the ones we have. Now I think that up to 40 plus tons per truck are allowed on the road. In the past, it was less, and the air was different. Now, I'm not going into the chemistry, but you can easily go over the internet and you will see what is the impact of CO2 and concentration of CO2 on the concrete, especially when there is a catalyst action made by SOx. It's more complicated, I mean, but it's something which, in my opinion, needs to be taken into account, and not only for the Genoa Bridge, of course. This raises questions. How are we placed with other infrastructure, whether it's in Italy? Of course, we have an extensive motorway network which was designed and made in the 60s, so we are certainly exposed to this. But the same might apply to other countries, certainly in Central Eastern Europe, but anywhere around the world, really. Was this risk ever taken into account? What should we do now to prevent further losses? How should we consider these factors? By the way, would this be a limitation to liability, or in the other way around, would this also give ground to liabilities? I think that these are all questions which will need to be addressed, perhaps not today, but in the near future. Now, statistics. You have already been shown data which is perhaps more significant and interesting than what I can provide you with. These are also slides coming or information coming from Swiss Re, so thank you to Angelica and her company. But you can clearly see that there is a pattern in which, especially natural catastrophes, the top right graph is showing the number of occurrences, so it's not reporting figures, not billions. But you can clearly see that the gray line is growing, I would say linearly for the time being, whereas man-made disasters seem to be, with the exception of some bumps, but almost constant in terms of numbers. Perhaps more interesting is the impact in terms of economic losses and insured losses, in which you can see that, by the way, natural catastrophes are by far overtaking man-made catastrophes. And you can clearly see that in 2017, Nat Cat insured losses were 131 versus 2016, 56 in terms of US dollars billions. So this gives an indication of what is happening as a whole in the industry. And I think that's it. I would be happy to answer to any question. Thank you very much.